Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Will Smith and I work at Sam Reed's bookshop in Grasmere. I'm delighted to be hosting the event this evening with Richard Atkinson. Richard will be talking about his wonderful family history and historical biography, which is Mr. Atkinson's Rum Contract. I shall, for promotional reasons, also show you, I've got the hardback edition here, this very beautiful object of the UK cover here. Richard is first and foremost a publisher who has worked on some of the most successful cookbooks of the past few years. I think I'm right in saying it was certainly on Dishoom and some of the River Cottage books as well, which also means hopefully Richard has worked with one of my personal heroes, Pam the Jam, who does the condiments cookbooks for River Cottage. Richard came to us greatly celebrated already ahead of his book. He was well thought of by many of his colleagues, and we were also then delighted to be a party to this wonderful book, which is both a family history and a historical biography. I reviewed it for Cumbria Life last summer, and I was delighted to be able to share it with readers then. I think it struck a chord with many people in Cumbria who had the time both to read and to reflect on their own family histories. And I think it's resonated more broadly with some of those interests which have been gaining in recent years about people's interests in where they come from, where their relatives have lived, and all of those kind of aspects about our own known and unknown heritage. And so I was just delighted to read a book which was not only involving, but is something like a Victorian 3-volume novel when it comes to the end of it. You feel like you've been through a whole cast of characters. So I'm delighted to introduce Richard this evening. He's going to give us a talk on the book, and then afterwards there'll be a chance both for me to chat with Richard, and as you go through the event, you can use our chat window if questions pop up that you'd like to ask, and we'll try and bring those up towards the end of the event and put those questions to Richard. So you've got this kind of unique chance this evening to ask for original content outside the covers of the book. But for now, just across to Richard. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much, Will. That was a very, very kind and generous introduction. So here I am in virtual Grasmere, and I couldn't be happier to be in almost the land of my ancestors. Right, I'm going to share the screen now. Hold on a sec. I'm going to turn this into an audio visual feast, possibly. Okay, so for more than a decade now, I have been a time traveler, shuttling backwards and forwards between the 18th and the 21st centuries. And during this time, I've been on an amazing historical odyssey, which has been made possible through thousands of letters and documents I've been lucky enough to track down in dozens of archives in England, Scotland, Jamaica, and the USA. So Mr. Atkinson's Rum Contract started as a personal project. I grew up knowing almost nothing about my dad's side of the family. He was an only child and he died when I was 4. My grandparents died soon afterwards, so there was no one to tell me about my paternal ancestors. Here we are, 3 generations of Atkinsons when I was a baby. My grandparents lived at Temple Sowerby, a village about 6 miles from Penrith, in a crumbling old house which had been in the family for many generations. By the time I knew it, in the early 1970s, the Georgian front of the house was completely uninhabitable due to dry rot, with floorboards up and ceilings down, and elsewhere throughout the house, buckets were positioned to catch rain dripping through the ceiling. The room I remember best at Temple Sowerby was the gallery. This was a long, sunny corridor at the back of the house overlooking the long walled garden. As a toddler, I took great delight in running up and down the gallery, stomping on the floorboards. There was also the added attraction of some rather eye-catching things to look at, including beautiful iridescent tropical birds in glass cases, a narwhal's tusk, and significantly, given what I later found out, 2 stuffed crocodiles, which you can see if you look carefully. In 1977, after 250 years of occupation, the Atkinson ancestral home at Temple Sabi was sold to developers, and the new owners turned it into a hotel. My sister and I grew up not knowing any cousins on our dad's side of the family. My hunt for family would start in my late 30s, when my wife and I realized that we wouldn't be able to have kids. So while many of our friends set about raising young families and looking to the future, I decided to travel in exactly the opposite direction, and I started poking around on ancestry.com and other genealogical websites. If I couldn't have a family in the present day, I reasoned, I'd find one in the past. I wasn't entirely prepared, however, for what I'd found. A lease dating from 1577, which I found in Cumbria archives at Kendal, an amazingly well-preserved document handwritten on vellum, told me that my Atkinson ancestors had been in Temple Sabi since at least the time of Queen Elizabeth I. For about 6 generations, they had been tanners. This was the malodorous but crucial business by which animal skins were transformed into leather. By the mid-18th century, at the time my book's story really gets going, they were prosperous tradesfolk, but it would be a stretch to call them landed gentry. My project snowballed, and it didn't take me long to find out that my ancestors had been involved in some very troubling events indeed. To spell it out, they were up to their necks in the business of slavery. I guess I could have taken the view that I'd rather not know. Instead, my determination to find out everything about it only increased. Indeed, I felt a really powerful sense of responsibility to get to the bottom of the business as much as I could and to tell their story more widely. Even though I could recite the kings and queens of England by heart, and I had studied history to A-level, I knew shockingly little about the slave trade, apart from the famous story of its abolition by William Wilberforce. And I suspected there were many others like me. After all, this was one of those less than glorious episodes of our history that we British have tended to brush under the carpet. I realized that with the archival material that I found, I'd be able to tell 2 stories. I could tell the intimate story of my ancestors, often in their own words, and I could also tell the panoramic story of a century of British war, trade, politics, and conquest. These 2 stories were tightly intertwined because it so happened that my ancestors had possessed an uncanny knack of positioning themselves, if not quite at the epicenter of historical events, often extremely close by. They played key roles during the American War of Independence and the French Revolutionary Wars, and their time of residence in Jamaica had extended from the very peak of the slave trade in the 1780s to the aftermath of abolition in the 1850s. Given that I was starting from scratch, I decided to frame my narrative as a kind of genealogical detective story, starting with my grandparents' house in Cumbria and ending, not that I knew they existed yet, with the ruins of the Atkinsons sugar estates in Jamaica. So it was simply just a case of gathering up the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and putting them all together, which was much easier said than done, not least because the puzzle turned out to have about 1,000 pieces. Anyway, I'd like to tell you about a few particularly memorable moments from my genealogical adventures. But first of all, to get the ball rolling, I'll read a few paragraphs from the beginning of my book. This is the story of my slave-owning Cumbrian ancestors. It started as a personal research project, an attempt to rectify my ignorance about my father's side of the family and lay to rest some demons which had dogged me ever since his death when I was a child. It would have been pleasing to learn that my Atkinson forefathers had been heroes or saints. Instead, I was confronted by an infinitely more challenging truth. Clearly, I could not wipe away my ancestors' sins, but I did hope that by telling the unvarnished truth about them, I would be able to help shine a light on a dark episode of history and show the degree to which slavery was woven into the warp and weft of Georgian society. As I gradually gathered and pieced together my sprawling narrative with its overarching themes of money, trade, politics, and war, I realized that I was doing something quite unusual, for it seemed that few tales of British slave-owning families had been written down, or at least not in such detail, let alone by a descendant of the guilty family. There was a tension at the heart of my project. Some ancestors, most notably Richard Atkinson, my 4 times great-grandmother, cookbook compiler and shell collector extraordinaire, proved easy to love. But her 5 sons were involved in appallingly exploitative acts. What's more, I found no clue among their plentiful correspondence that they harbored misgivings about the moral foundation of their wealth, even as the anti-slavery movement picked up pace. From today's standpoint, I could see that their behavior was utterly inexcusable, and yet these were middle-class Englishmen who, in the eyes of their peers, were living well within the bounds of propriety in the law, and were by no means exceptional for their time. Occasionally, I found myself wondering what I would have done had I been in their position. No one embodied these ambiguities more clearly than the central figure of this book, the founder of the family fortune, my namesake, Richard Atkinson. As a businessman, his vast wealth and influence were rooted in aggressive, ruthless trade with the West and East Indies, and yet his private letters revealed him to have had a gentle, generous side. Gradually, I came to realize that the tangled inheritance which Atkinson had bequeathed to his nephews and nieces encapsulated, in miniature, the legacy of the wealth that slavery had generated for Britain as a whole. Perhaps in a way, my struggle to resolve my feelings about my Georgian family is comparable to an ambivalence that many of us feel about this country's past. We may admire our elegant Georgian crescents, squares, and terraces, while simultaneously loathing the fact that many of them were built on the back of slavery. So I'm not a professional writer, although I've been working with writers on a daily basis for almost 30 years. My dad was a book publisher, and after graduating from university, I followed him into the same trade. By happy accident, happy because I greatly enjoy food, I became an editor of cookbooks. Some chefs on whose books I've worked over the years include Hugh Fearnley-Whittingstall, Heston Blumenthal, Raymond Blanc, and a whole heap more. Amazingly, given what I do for a living, it would turn out to be the discovery of a cookbook that transformed my family research project into something much, much bigger. This extract tells the story of an amazing weekend that would change the course of my life. By now, I was in the grip of an obsession, spending all my spare time online in pursuit of my ancestors. One evening during the autumn of 2010, I was browsing the website of Temple Sabi House Hotel, which included a short page dedicated to the history of the place. And although it was a fairly unexciting account, one paragraph leapt out at me. This was a description of a fascinating recipe or receipt book written by Richard Atkinson for her daughter Dorothy Clayton in 1806, which gave instructions, among other dishes, for collard eels, roasted tench, and a sauce to serve with larks. I knew that this Richard Atkinson was my 4 times great-grandmother. My sister and I had inherited a number of her books. We knew they were hers because she always signed her name on the title page, including, my favourite, an account of the culture and use of the mangel wurzel, or root of scarcity, translated from the French of the Abbé de Commerel, and The British Housewife, or The Cook, Housekeeper's and Gardener's Companion, by Mrs. Martha Bradley. But this was the first I'd heard of Bridget having written a recipe book of her own. I published cookbooks for a living. Suffice to say, my interest was piqued. So I did something I never thought of doing. I stayed a night at the hotel. Arriving at Temple Sabi around tea time, I parked near the maypole, beside the large stone from which John Wesley was said to have preached in 1782. It was a crisp November day. Across the road, the curtains of the hotel had not yet been drawn, and its brightly lit reception rooms radiated hospitality. Before checking in, I went for a short stroll as far as the old tannery buildings at the other end of the village. Walking around the green, I found myself appraising Temple Sabi as if visiting for the first time. With its handsome Georgian houses, coaching inn, and red sandstone church, it seemed a delightful place, much more peaceful than I remembered it too, since a new bypass had diverted all the lorries which had once rumbled through the village. Over at the hotel, Julie Evans, one of the proprietors, greeted me warmly. She already knew about my connection to the house and had reserved a room for me at the back with a view down the garden. It was nice and cozy, in a chintzy kind of way, and the ensuite bathroom with its jacuzzi tub was a definite upgrade from the Spartan facilities of the Atkinson era. Even so, a small, churlish part of me resented the fitted carpets and double glazing, and yearned for the house of my grandparents. As a child, my favourite place had been the gallery, with its clattery floorboards and oak furniture, some of which now dominated my living room in South London. But it seemed that when Temple Sabi House was turned into a hotel in the late 1970s, the gallery had been carved up to make bedrooms, including the one I would be sleeping in. To describe my emotions as agitated would be an understatement. As I sat down to dinner, the only guest that night, I had never felt more lonely. Julie took pity on me after my solitary meal, and we chatted in the parlour. I brought a shoebox full of old family letters up from London with me, and we leafed through them together. Then I asked Julie the question I'd been burning to put to her since arriving. What could she tell me about this receipt book that was mentioned on the hotel website? She left the room and returned a couple of minutes later, cradling an old quarter-pound book. She handed it to me. I opened it cautiously, not knowing what might be inside, and was amazed to find almost 800 recipes, handwritten in a highly legible script. It was evident from the sheer variety of meat, fish, and game dishes in her repertoire that Richard Atkinson had kept an excellent table. Many of her recipes included spices and flavourings that to this day carry a whiff of the exotic, such as cinnamon, ginger, nutmeg, curry powder, candied lemons, and orange flower water. Although the instructions she gave were cursory at best, and her methods on the antiquated side, she was, after all, cooking over an open fire. Many of the recipes, especially the puddings and preserves, seemed perfectly relatable to the present. I could imagine trying to make them at home. Not so the recipes in the last third of the book, where Bridget offered remedies for every conceivable domestic situation or ailment. For berry bushes infested with caterpillars, to prevent milk from having a taste of turnips, a pomatum for the face after the smallpox, for worms in children, against spitting of blood, to prevent bad effects of a fall from a high place, to cure the bite of a mad dog, for insanity. Bridget would have been in her 70s when she started compiling this volume for her daughter. It was odd to think she might well have written it in the same room in which I was at that moment sitting. For so long I had associated Temple Sabi House with death and decay. Only now could I sense it as a bustling family home. In all my life, I had never coveted a single object as much as this wondrous book. So I felt crushed when Julie explained that it belonged to a private collector from Newcastle and would soon have to be returned. I must have looked so downcast that Julie insisted I should immediately write to the owner, Miss Dunn, to ask whether I might buy the book. Indeed, she thrust pen, paper, and envelope at me and promised to post my letter. When I opened the curtains the next morning, the sky was a brilliant blue. Overnight, there'd been a heavy frost. After breakfast, I walked across the road to the churchyard, crunching through glittery grass in search of Atkinson graves. Then I set off for Northumberland to spend a couple of nights with my godmother near Corbridge. My route over the Pennines took me on a zigzag road up the steep side of the Eden Valley, through the ancient lead mining town of Alston, and across an ocean of bronze heather, dropping down alongside the South Tyne, a spectacular drive. That afternoon I had a couple of hours to spare, so I visited Chester's Fort, one of several Roman garrisons along Hadrian's Wall, now maintained by English Heritage. I knew from my family research that some cousins, the Claytons, had once lived in the big house near the ruins and had been responsible for their excavation. Bridget's daughter, Dorothy, had married Nathaniel Clayton, the Newcastle lawyer who purchased the property. Wandering around the neat stone footings, I struggled to imagine 500 Roman cavalry ever having occupied such a peaceful spot. As drizzle hardened into rain, I took refuge in the small museum attached to the site. Near the entrance was a glass case devoted to the life of John Clayton, owner of Chester's for much of the 19th century. Among the objects on display was an old book which had belonged to his grandmother, Richard Atkinson. As usual, her name was inscribed on the title page. Then something even more extraordinary caught my eye. It was the facsimile of a letter written by Bridget in January 1758, when she would have been in her mid-20s, in which she was begging her sister to placate their mother, who was furious that she'd got married the previous Saturday without telling anyone. My heart pounded as I processed this. Did it mean that Bridget had eloped? And how had the museum come by this letter? As soon as I could, following my return to London, I made contact with the curator of the museum at Chester's, Georgina Plowright, who delivered a surprising piece of news. She had recently unearthed a treasure trove of correspondence between the Atkinson and Clayton families, 6 large boxes spanning the 18th and 19th centuries in the Northumberland archives, buried among the papers of another local family, the Allgoods of Nunnick Hall. And then there was Richard Atkinson's receipt book, the scent of which had lured me north in the first place. 2 days after my return, I received a call from Irene Dunn in response to the letter I had written from Temple Sabi. She told me she was a retired librarian with a special interest in books about food. She had found Bridget's manuscript at an antiquarian bookseller's in Bath about 15 years earlier. It so happened that I had approached Irene at the perfect moment. She was now looking to downsize and was tickled by the thought of selling the book to me, a descendant of Bridget. One bright Saturday in January, I travelled by train up to Newcastle to meet Irene for lunch in a restaurant on the quayside and to carry my prize home. And here it is. It's Bridget's cookbook, which is an amazing thing. And I love it. Okay, that's a very long extract. That's my longest extract. It's now time to introduce you to the main character of my book, Richard Atkinson's brother-in-law, my 5 times great uncle, Richard Rum Atkinson. Born in 1739, Richard Atkinson left Temple Sabi when he was 16 to go and work for Samuel Touchett, a well-known merchant in the city of London, whose business interests included ships that pursued the triangular trade. The triangular trade was, of course, the vile system by which British manufactured goods, in Touchett's case, cotton textiles made by his family firm in Manchester, were shipped to West Africa, where they were bartered for enslaved men, women, and children, who were then transported across the Atlantic to be sold for a lifetime of backbreaking servitude in the plantations. Oh, this is Richard's signature at the age of 16, shortly after he started working for Samuel Touchett. It was also while Richard was working for Touchett that he would meet another junior clerk, Francis Baring, who would go on to establish the greatest banking dynasty of the age. It was Baring's, for example, who would finance the Louisiana Purchase that in 1802 doubled the size of the USA. Richard's warm friendship with Francis Baring would prove of huge importance to the next generation of Atkinsons in Jamaica. So this miniature, painted by Richard Cosway, shows Richard in 1783 in his prime, 2 years before his untimely death. Richard's career was spectacular by any standards, but especially so given the humbleness of his family background. He was by far the largest contractor to the British Army during the American War of Independence, supplying everything from uniforms and barracks equipment to barrels of salted pork and sacks of horse fodder to the troops fighting the rebellious colonists. His nickname, Rum Atkinson, derived from 3 rather cosy deals he struck with the British Commander-in-Chief in New York to supply 500,000 gallons of the strongest Jamaican rum. These deals prompted angry accusations of corruption and cronyism from the opposition and triggered 4 years of parliamentary inquiries. Richard was the owner of an East India Company ship, the Bessborough, which made 4 trading voyages to China. Here she is. He was also a leading director of the East India Company, an alderman of the City of London, an MP, and a close advisor to William Pitt the Younger. His notoriety is suggested by James Gilray in this cartoon, Westminster School, where the 25-year-old Prime Minister, Pitt, is depicted as a schoolboy being beaten by Charles James Fox, the leader of the opposition. Richard can be seen behind, his rum contract sticking out of his pocket. Can you spot him? Richard was clearly a brilliant man, but also a deeply flawed one. It goes almost without saying that his dealings relating to slavery must forever tarnish his memory. Sometimes it felt impossible to reconcile the different sides of his character. It was through his letters to the Scottish aristocrat Lady Anne Lindsay that I would get first to see his generous, loving side. Sadly, however, the love was of the unrequited variety. Richard died in May 1785 in Brighton, probably from tuberculosis. And he was buried in the old parish church there. The last few months of his life are quite shadowy. There's little correspondence from this time. It was left to a Jamaican archive to spring a massive surprise and reveal a mystery that I suspect I will never be able to solve. Richard's death left me bereft. He was such a dynamic personality, such an incurable optimist, and it seemed unthinkable that he would no longer be present in this story. By chance, he was the same age as me, almost to the month, when I came to write about his death, a coincidence that added a frisson to my emotional response. I certainly felt humbled by how much he had packed into his 46 years. Richard's character had embodied some startling contradictions. Indeed, the gulf between his private and public identities could hardly have seemed wider. On the one hand, there was the rejected lover and saintly benefactor, as recalled by Lady Anne Lindsay, and on the other, there was the shrewd businessman and political fixer, as portrayed by his critics. He was also, lest we forget, a slave owner. The more time I spent in the company of these multiple Richard Atkinsons, however, the easier I found it to see them as facets of the same man. I came to realize too that Anne's memoirs had been written with the rose-tinted nostalgia of 30 years hindsight, but equally that the ad hominem attacks of the journalists often bore little relation to the target of their derision. So now we reach what is, for me, the greatest mystery of this story, the discovery of a record so unsettling that it made me wonder whether I would ever know Richard at all. It consists of the copy of a legal deed, which I found within a crumbling volume in the archive of the Registrar General's office at Spanish Town, the old colonial capital of Jamaica. This document states that on the 1st of May, 1785, Samuel Muir agreed to grant, bargain, sell, transfer, assign, and deliver over unto the said Richard Atkinson, his heirs and assigns, the following Negro slaves, viz. Betty and her 3 children, with the future issue, offspring, and increase of the said slaves, in exchange for £120 of the island's currency. Betty's vendor, Samuel Muir, was one of Richard's business partner's sons and managed several of his family's sugar estates in Jamaica. For what earthly reason could Richard have felt the need to purchase 4 slaves less than a month before his death? I turned the question over and over in my mind, trying to imagine scenarios that might have led to so singular a transaction, but ultimately it seemed so domestic, so private, that I could only suppose Betty was Richard's mistress and the 3 children were his children. Then I remembered the letter written by Richard in December 1782, sent to Anne along with the final draft of his will, in which he had expressed a desire to throw his whole heart open to her and to reveal its most secret sensations. As attentive readers may recall, he had continued in the same intimate vein. The consciousness that her eye must review it would be sufficient to keep out all the black family, and as to human frailties, the heart knows much less than mine, but does not know that under the influence of a generous confidence, they would become the very cement of its best happiness. The first time I read that passage, I must confess, my eyes slid over it. I suppose I thought Richard's reference to the black family was an obscure figure of speech. It had not crossed my mind that he might mean a black family of his own, for I knew he had never visited Jamaica. The dense paper trail of his letters in all the archives left no gap long enough to allow for such an absence. But black servants could be found in many wealthy London households at this time, and it seems likely that the Muirs brought Betty over to work for them. She must at some point have entered into a relationship with Richard. According to the laws of slavery, The offspring of an enslaved female automatically belonged to her owner. So presumably, through his deathbed purchase, Richard hoped to spare Betty and the children the fate of being returned to the West Indies. If he had wished unambiguously to guarantee their liberty, he could have freed them in a codicil to his will, which would, however, have carried the drawback of declaring their existence to the world. The whole subject is deeply uncomfortable, especially as the scarcity of information has driven me so much further down the path of conjecture than I would like. The story of Betty and her family raises so many questions, none of which I suspect will ever be answered. There is too little evidence to go on. Where was she born? Where did she grow up? How did Richard treat her? What were the children called? Did Richard make provision for them after his death? Did they go on to have families? Might any of their descendants be alive today? So Richard's affairs unravelled after his death. The size of his estate was the subject of much public tittle-tattle. One valuation was £300,000, about £40 million today by the most conservative estimate. But the will by which Richard intended to enrich his extended family and his closest friends turned out to be a pie-in-the-sky affair, dependent on some far-fetched projections of the future produce of his Jamaican sugar estates. 40 years of bitter lawsuits followed his death, during which time, in the manner of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, most of the money disappeared into the hands of the lawyers. Now we're going to jump forward a decade or so to Jamaica, where 4 of Richard's nephews, Bridget's sons, had gone in order to run the estates left them by their uncle. This picture shows Montego Bay. The islands belong to one of the Atkinsons' estates. It looks like paradise, but for the enslaved population, it was a living hell. Of the 4 Atkinson men of this next generation who went out to Jamaica, it's fair to say they had mixed fortunes. 2 of them, Dick and John, died from yellow fever in their mid-20s, shortly after landing on the island. This statistic is typical. About 1 in 3 Europeans would be dead within 3 years of first arriving in the West Indies. This illustration depicts the yellow fever with its scythe always lurking beneath the surface of life in Jamaica. One of the Atkinson brothers, George, would make a huge personal fortune through acting as the commercial agent to the governor of Jamaica during the disastrous 5-year British occupation of Saint-Domingue. Saint-Domingue was the French colony that would soon afterwards throw off the shackles of slavery to become Haiti. I'm descended from Matt, the laziest of the Atkinson brothers, who spent 12 years in Jamaica and left behind debts and, the baptism records attest, numerous children of colour through his liaisons with enslaved and free women of colour. It was Matt who was the senior partner on the island when the family firm branched into slave trading, as is demonstrated by this advert, which I found in the National Library of Jamaica. As evidence of an ancestor's transgressions go, this is about as damning as it gets, but I felt it was essential to show this advertisement in the book. It certainly paints a picture of Matt as a cruel, callous individual, but the reality seems a lot more nuanced. In complete contrast, Matt was regarded by his family members in England as charming and something of a pushover. My poor father, he certainly had the kindest heart, best temper I ever knew, wrote one of his sons. I must admit, this contradiction really bothered me when I was writing the book. I wanted to show my slave-owning ancestors as fully rounded individuals, and yet it felt almost wrong to do so, given the climate of discourse around the highly sensitive subject of slavery. But I also knew that to portray them as one-dimensional monsters would do a disservice to history and the truth. Before I started researching the slave trade, I had vaguely perceived those engaged in it as a wicked subspecies that was somehow set apart from respectable mercantile trade. However, what I discovered was much more complex and troubling because slave labour was thought fundamental to Britain's wealth for much of the 18th century and widely viewed as a necessary evil. It was only in the 1780s, when the abolition movement got going, that it started to attract mainstream opposition. It was incidentally through Matt that the Atkinson family can claim a connection to the Wordsworth family. I know this is a prerequisite of giving a talk to a bookshop based in Grasmere. Matt's brother-in-law was Captain John Wordsworth, a first cousin of the poet, who lived in a house beside Ullswater, which was built and previously inhabited by the great abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. William and Dorothy Wordsworth had often visited the Clarksons there. In fact, it was while they were walking along the lake shore on their way home to Dove Cottage that they noticed the long belt of daffodils about the breadth of a country turnpike road, which would inspire Wordsworth to write his most famous verse. Matt's father-in-law, Isaac Littledale, was a prominent Whitehaven merchant and ship owner who traded with Virginia and was entertained by George Washington at Mount Vernon. Today, his portrait hangs in the Wordsworth House at Cockermouth. Now I'm going to take you to the Northumberland archives at Woodhorn, where I had what was undoubtedly the most emotional experience of my entire archival adventure, one which left me sobbing and speechless. But first, to set the scene, Bridget Atkinson's eldest daughter, Dorothy, as a young woman, had lived with her uncle, Richard Atkinson, at his house in the City of London, and had nursed him on his deathbed in Brighton. The year after Richard's death, Dorothy married Nathaniel Clayton, the town clerk of Newcastle. Dorothy and Nathaniel would have 11 children and a long, loving marriage. It was their son, John Clayton, who also as town clerk presided over the development of Newcastle's magnificent new town centre in the 1830s, thus the naming of Clayton Street. John also bought up and restored 18 miles of Hadrian's Wall, but that's another story. It was Dorothy for whom Bridget would write the recipe book, a labour of love reflecting the deep bond between mother and daughter, as well as their fondness for good food. Soon after I found out about the large stash of family papers in Northumberland, I spent 3 intense, immersive days working my way through them. It was an amazing feeling, sifting through hundreds of letters written by dozens of family members of whose existence I had not until then been even aware. Their letters represented the full range of human emotions, joy, sadness, anger, fear, and revealed my forebears to have lived eventful, worldly lives. It felt rather as though I was standing on the wrong side of a massive door, locked out from a noisy family gathering that was taking place on the other side. It was deeply frustrating to be so close and yet so far removed from these people to whom I was intimately connected. At the same time, I had the most bittersweet sensation that I would never again know them as well as I did at that particular moment, after 3 days immersion in their lives, and I dreaded having to say goodbye to them. So here's what happened on my last day at the archives as I was preparing to take my leave. It was especially hard on Nathaniel Clayton, as an unflagging writer of letters, that the use of his right hand would be badly hampered in his later years by gout. Nathaniel's poor health was a constant source of anxiety to Dorothy, but it was she who would die first, on the 3rd of August 1827, after a combination of medicine and leeches failed to ease a bowel complaint from which he had been suffering. I found myself moved quite unexpectedly by Dorothy's death. Early on, during my family research, I went up to Northumberland to explore the Atkinson-Clayton correspondence in the county archives. Over 3 exhilarating days, I read my way through 6 boxes filled with hundreds of letters and met many family members for the first time. On the afternoon of my last day at the archives, as closing time approached, I had almost finished going through the final box. Right at the bottom, I found a small roll of paper, the size of a cigar, on which I noticed that Nathaniel had inscribed, in the shaky handwriting of his old age, these words: "A lock of my beloved wife's hair." I unrolled it, taking care to disturb the contents as little as possible. The hair was mousy brown, very fine, with just a glint of silver. I fought to hold back the tears when I realized what was happening. I was reaching across 5 generations and touching, yes, actually touching, my great-great-great-great aunt. So, as you'll recall, my initial impulse to research my family came from a longing to connect with them at a time when I was grieving for the loss of the children I would never have. And even though many of my 18th century ancestors proved to be, how should we put this, deeply flawed individuals, still I was able to take away a good deal of self-knowledge and a degree of solace through finding out about them. Better still, along the way, I would come across numerous living cousins, ranging in distance from a second cousin to a seventh cousin, of whose ignorance I had previously been ignorant. Getting to know them has been one of the thrills of my life. It's true what they say, blood really is thicker than water. So finally, to bring you right up to date, I'd like to end by telling you about a new family connection that has brought me immeasurable joy over the last year. This tale has a final twist. Shortly after the hardback of Mr. Atkinson's rum contract came out, I did an online interview for the Tring Book Festival that was posted on YouTube. It was a long, rambling conversation, and I had no idea who might want to watch it. A few weeks later, the festival director forwarded me a message which had just landed in his inbox. "This is one of the more extraordinary emails we've received," he wrote. It came from a woman called Yvette Hewitt, who'd found my interview while doing her own family research. "My interest was immediately piqued as my family were enslaved by the Atkinson family in Jamaica," she wrote. "I am a committee member of the Hennepin County Family History Fair, which is an annual genealogy event in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There is a growing reconciliation and reunification movement in the United States of both enslaved and slave-owning families. My family always spoke about our Caucasian ancestors, and part of my genealogical goal is to unify that past in a positive light." I leapt at the chance to respond to Yvette. Over several emails, we exchanged stories. It turned out that she was the mysterious American woman whose DNA had matched that of my second and third cousins in Norway. Yvette's DNA did not match mine, which, given the likely distance of our relationship, was to be expected, but there was another conclusive piece of evidence. Her 85-year-old father, David Wright, came from Galloway, a tiny village within the boundary of the Deans Valley estate that the Atkinsons had once owned in Jamaica, which I had passed through on my way to try and find the crumbling ruins of the sugar works there. I learned that Yvette and I had more than just a common ancestor in common. We had both embarked on our convergent genealogical paths during the same year, and for similarly personal reasons. There's no way of knowing for sure, but my hunch is that we're descended from Matt, the most promiscuous of Richard Atkinson's 5 sons, who lived in Jamaica from 1793 to 1805, which would make us 4th cousins. Matt was a serial rapist, but without him, neither of us would exist. One Sunday, shortly before Christmas, my sister Harriet and I met up with Yvette and her husband Craig on Zoom. The 4 of us had a wonderfully easy, freewheeling conversation, and the warm glow of goodwill was palpable. An hour or so after we finished chatting, I received the following message. "Dear Richard and Harriet, it was an enjoyable morning for us. Our relationship is special, and I cherish it dearly. My parents send their love. Welcome to our big, crazy West Indian family." I was touched and humbled by Yvette's generosity. I'd never dreamt, when I first started searching for my 18th century ancestors, that it would lead to such a connection. And while this may not be the final destination on my voyage of family discovery, it feels like a good place to pause along the way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm just astounded by that, and certainly that last twist in the tale that's happened since the hardback was published too. I'm so grateful to you for the talk and for adding that codicil to the book itself. I've got a few questions. I'll put them to you now, but it's worth saying as well, if anyone has questions that they want to ask Richard, if you pop those in the chat, we'll also introduce those into our discussion now. So if there's anything burning you'd like to ask, please do use the chat box and we'll put it to Richard. So first off, I was really fascinated, I suppose, in this being a 10-year project. You've got all of this material, you followed so many kind of lines and hints and archives. How did you both kind of organize that and also decide how you were going to follow a family line, where you would stop and where you would start in trying to make this a narrative?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think I was it's a complicated question to answer, because the truth is, when I started, I didn't really know what I was doing. It's strange. I'm a publisher by trade. I publish books. I've edited, many books, but I didn't know how to write a book when I started. And it was very daunting. It was super daunting, and I realized I realized that I just had to put one foot in front of the other and just get on with it. And it took so much longer than I possibly could have imagined as a result of just simply having to kind of trudge my way up a mountain, as it were. How did I organize the material? I was quite lucky. In fact, relatively early on, I was quite lucky in that I actually kind of knew the narrative arc pretty early, because obviously it was provided by the base, because I was able to find the kind of key family documents relatively early on. The Northumberland Archive ones are essential, and there were some in the National Library of Scotland which were also kind of essential. But I had the kind of the key narrative early on, but then I had to fill in lots of, just hundreds and hundreds of gaps, and fill in all sorts of details that I just I needed in order to kind of provide color, and and also just I wanted as much as possible to make it a kind of to make it so that everything had a reason for being there, but also there weren't kind of leaps which I wanted people to understand this quite a complicated story. So everything had to be accounted for on some level, I felt. And there were some very key bits of information which I found relatively late in the day, and frustratingly late in the day. I mean, for instance, I had a real worry about how I was going to write about the family's business activities in Jamaica. And I mean, for several years, I was like, oh my goodness, I just don't know nearly enough about what they were actually doing there, because there's very little actual discussion of business affairs in the family correspondence. And I think that, I imagine that to some extent, what went in Jamaica stayed in Jamaica, for reasons that are probably obvious. And so I knew very little there was very little in it from the family correspondence. And hallelujah, I found quite late in the day, having already been to this particular archive and been sort of turned away with almost nothing, I went to the Baring, I sort of revisited the Baring archive in the City of London, and found literally 5 folders, chock-a-block, with letters between Sir Francis Baring mostly and members of the family in Jamaica over about 15-20 years. Literally thousands of letters, or 1,000 letters perhaps 1,000 pages anyway. It was just extraordinary. I mean, but I also discovered it when I was well into the writing process, and I did have a kind of like, part of me wishes this hadn't happened, because I had to kind of unpick quite a lot. Anyway.
And I suppose the follow-up, I'm just thinking of that because of how we maybe follow our family history, and the bits that pathways we take are kind of affective pathways. We're emotionally involved in the journeys of our ancestors, whether we feel we are or not, or the impulse that strikes us. And so that the kind of companion question is really, how do you deal with that, the emotional investment you have to a family history, and your very unique kind of effective drive to it, when you obviously are following very flawed figures and people who are hugely complicit in horrific circumstances. what does that do to you in terms of what you're doing with your emotional journey, your kind of push to it?
It's a very strange emotional journey because it's my impulse for sort of embarking on the path that led to the book was to find my family, and to inevitably I had some kind of inbuilt, what's sympathy, is that the right word? I had a predisposition towards them. So every time I found, if there was an awful lot of involvement, an awful lot of disappointment involved in finding out what they'd done, I'd think, oh my gosh, not another thing. There were several documents that I found which were just actually, I found really crushing, because even though I'd known they were involved in slavery, it was another facet to their involvement, which was like, oh God, But it was complicated, and I was aware that it was complicated, and I couldn't, it was hard to unpick, actually, and I suppose I spoke about it a little bit. I think that by telling it warts and all, but with the sort of, not entirely unsympathetically, I hope that it in some ways does a better service to the history, because it shows that actually what might be considered something that was very sort of a very small deviant part of the national activity, nation's activity, was actually much more sort of omnipresent. And and the fact that for instance that members of my family who had been in Jamaica were able to were sort of socially connected to perhaps at one degree of separation, but with abolitionists, or it shows how it wasn't, it was everywhere.
And that I think that kind of interconnection really comes across in the book, and the feeling I had when I was reading this, and it perhaps is due to kind of contemporary discussions being that much more prominent, that there weren't these obvious stories being told about British complicity, like you say, at this kind of familial level, that tells it from a kind of a personal side instead of an institutional side. So have you kind of spoken to people in terms of how you try to understand that connection? Where, I mean, you're in the book trade anyway. Have you managed to have conversations with people who kind of helped you consider some of this, or reflect on that kind of problematic political personal history?
Have I talked to people? I mean, I have talked to, I did talk to a number of people along the way who are writing in this sort of in the kind of arena, and I was very lucky to be helped by the or advised by the at the time director of the Legacies of British Slave Owning project at UCL. But I think, but I did feel quite on, I felt fairly on my own about it, because it was, it's quite a strange story, and it's quite a strange thing to be doing in a way, to be in effect kind of pulling all the skeletons out of the cupboard. And I, and I know there were people who, who are near to me, who were worried about what I was doing. I mean, and I was grateful to them for worrying, although it didn't always necessarily make it easier. But I mean, generally people have been very kind in their reaction. So I touch wood, they'll continue to be, but who knows?
I mean, that is wonderful to hear in that sense, because it's such an involving book in that way, and and as you tell it, the detection element is key. The kind of in a potted version, what you've given us this evening in the talk is that kind of discovery and the joy of discovery, alongside the frustration and the pitfalls of it.
Yeah,
to feel that kind of visceral attachment to the material is just fascinating. And I suppose I'm wondering around those portions, not least of the continuing mysteries, but also where you feel like there is another story, those moments where you literally say that, but that's another story.
No, that's right. Rabbit holes, many rabbit holes. I mean, there were points at which there were points. I mean, like the mystery of Betty in particular, which I mentioned. There's another mystery of a little boy who was another illegitimate offspring in Jamaica. One of Bridget's grandsons, who was sent back to Temple Zabi to be educated, and he disappears from the story. And I'd love to know what happened to him. He was called James. I think he went back. I think he went to Jamaica, but when he was about 14, he just leaves the family story, and there's no references of him ever again. But yeah, it's fascinating to to corral it all was sometimes difficult. I mean, I had to cut things out.
And I guess I should say as well, the fact that not just that you managed to corral it all together, but with your own attention to the ways in books are put together, the hardback and the paperback are both beautiful objects.
Oh, you're very kind to say so. Thank you.
I think you're perhaps lucky in the sense that you have the understanding of those, but how much of a hand were you able to have in the production of the object? Most people just get to write the contents. Did you?
Quite a lot. I mean, that's because I had a very indulgent publisher, but also probably speaks something about my how do I put this, control freakery. I don't know. I'm a publisher who specializes in highly illustrated books, which have idiosyncratic production values. So it was inevitable. I was going to be interested, and luckily my publisher pretty much allowed me to get on with it, and I wanted it to be a book that was kind of redolent of its time, of the times it was discussing. I mean, of course, it's a modern book. You can tell that, but I wanted to so for instance, I commissioned the woodcuts, which decorate it and show pictures of kind of family heirlooms, among other things, which are kind of reminiscent of the woodcuts of Thomas Bewick, who in fact was another friend of Matt, the disgraceful Matts in Gateshead. He was also Thomas Bewick, who was also a great abolitionist. So that was one facet that I commissioned. I mean, I corralled all the photographs and pictures, and the typeface is called Bell, and it dates from the 18th century, and blah blah blah. I was involved.
And I suppose, I mean, speaking of Bewick, you've got your own cast of characters, and you're encountering new characters as you progress. But I have one question here, which is to suggest that if Yvette has been working on a parallel family history, is there either a kind of a different parallel book you could conceive of, or perhaps even a project which might be a future project to work together to think about a kind of a bridging narrative to the history that is hard to determine from the book that you've written at present?
What do you think, Yvette? I happen to know she's on the call. Sorry, no, you don't feel you have to unmask her. Poor Yvette. I think that's a fascinating idea. I really do. I think that's a genuinely fascinating idea. And it would be, yeah. I mean, absolutely. It's an extraordinary idea.
It's one of those things where I know that when I spoke to you earlier, I was saying, well, is this your first book? And you said, well, it was your first and only book. But part of the project, I think, of family history is always sort of where do you stop, and how much more do you want to know? Is there more still to be discovered? Even if we think we have left at an apposite point with the narrative we've got to, how much are those kinds of other kinds of stories and tales really there to flesh out what we already know? What more might we need, particularly in terms of the history of Jamaica as well in this book, and what that says, because a lot of the book here is about British political governance.
Yes, I mean it's a bit of a ragbag of all sorts of topics, and it was something which it's a baggy family saga, albeit with with a lot of kind of quite key moments. But I mean that was one of the kind of, if you like, problems with pitching it, was that actually, for some people they're extremely interested. There were some people who were super interested in the Jamaican part of the story, but kind of found the William Pitt the Younger, or the rum contracts quite sort of quite like weren't so interested in that. I mean, perhaps they might have said it slightly more rudely than that as well. But for other people, they were absolutely intrigued by Richard Atkinson's involvement in bringing William Pitt the Younger to power, and his his corrupt cronyist, who knows, so I think that what was the question anyway? Have I answered it, whatever it was?
Yeah, I think it sort of ties into what the outcome of these projects are, where they go, and also the kind of richness of trying to understand your family history alongside the real history. And the fascinating angle for many of the readers I encountered last year was the Cumbrian history to this book. And I hope that's also going to be a way in which you can continue to discover and learn more, although obviously this is the product of 10 years work, and I wouldn't want to suggest that you should.
I have a day job which I have to concentrate on now.
But there is that kind of that beauty of the fact that the receipt book's at the center of this too, when it comes back to your own personal project. I mean, is it something whereby the receipt book itself is its own kind of thing to celebrate?
Possibly. There's another receipt book as well, actually, which we discovered halfway, which I don't even mention in the book actually, but it was discovered by chance by a historian called Ivan Day. Ivan discovered anyway. So, but I couldn't find a way to sort of to jemmy it into the book, so I had to leave it out.
Yes, but I suppose it's one of those things about thinking about how your experience is going to share with other readers here, and whether it can kind of offer some messages to people who are undertaking their own kinds of research too. I think.
Yes, I mean, I think that it's putting to one side the graft of writing the book, which was at times excruciating, the process of finding out about the family, and also the how I feel about the kind of, as it were, the sort of sense of sort of satisfaction in self, and sort of self that it's brought to me. I couldn't recommend it more. And even though there's an awful lot that's incredibly sad about this history, I found for me there've been so many positive outcomes through finding out more about it and making it public.
And it's amazing that this came, well, the link that you discussed came from a talk like this in summer. So the idea that books and talks have that capacity to
exactly
is a wonderful thing. I think I have other questions which end up being quite detailed, so I may actually follow up with you after the talk and provide the detailed questions there. I was glad to see that obviously you reflected on the Grasmerian setting of this.
I felt that it was essential.
With the Wordsworth connection. So we're very grateful for you to spend this time with us this evening and to follow up on this project with us. I'll just put another call out. If there are any other questions people want to ask Richard, you can do so now, or obviously
speak now or forever hold your peace.
Oh yes, okay. So Diane has asked, are you actually being approached by other individuals who are finding their own families linked to the slave trade? Has that been an outcome of the book?
No, I haven't actually. I've been in touch with Alex Renton, who's written his book, and he and I are in contact. But no, I haven't. No.
Okay, but
I mean, but it's a good question, because it's more than conceivable that I could be, but no, for some reason I haven't.
And I mean, some of this obviously is to do with perhaps the unique conditions of the past year, but the sense of what you've discovered in the legacy of documents, that this is a book that will remain open for people to attach to you and inquire with you about. And so whether it evolves will be really fascinating.
So, I mean, who knows exactly? But at least it's there, and it's got detailed footnotes, so anyone can find the documents if they want to.
Yes, and also it has to be said, not just documents. There's a wonderful index, and the maps to start with are just beautiful. So it's a really well presented kind of discovery in and of itself. So I feel very grateful for you to be able to be here with us, and I will wrap up now, and thank you, and also thank HarperCollins for allowing us and connecting us to do this talk, to thank everyone who's attended this evening, and to say, yes, if people do have any kinds of follow-up questions or curious connections they would like to make, I'm sure we can put those people in touch with Richard after the event. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.